Now this is a really good place for us to be sort of talking about 500, this cow manure preparation that Steiner talks about. Because what he's talking about is that we're going to be getting a substance that's coming out of the metabolic system, manure, is coming out of the metabolic system, right? And then we're going to do something with it. We're going to actually put it into the soil through the winter time. And then we're going to be using that. And the way he describes this is not so much in the terms of earthly forces and cosmic substance, but he talks a lot about etheric and astral. So this is in the 4th lecture. He talks about compost early on. So in this picture here, I'll just bring you back to this sort of image of the cow. And he's talking about, we've got these activities coming from the front of the cow and these activities coming from the back of the cow. And initially, he calls all this the moon and all this the sun. And so this is like the female part of the cow, and this is the male part of the cow. And so he starts talking about the role of the cow horn, that with the 500, we're going to be getting the manure that's coming out of the back of the cow, and we're going to put it in a horn that's in the front of the cow here, and then, what have we got? We've got to really get it. He's making up. This is a, how would you call it? He's making a spell here. Literally. He's doing something that is putting these various energies together that is going to be something to do something, right? So there's very specific things that he's doing. And so the first thing he talks about is what's the cow horn? And so a big thing of the cow horn is that it's very hard. It's got this thing, I think it's called keratin, that is hardening the outside of the horn. And so he indicates this polarity between the cow and the deer. And when you've got the antlers of the deer, that hardened exterior part of the cow horn is the velvet that's on the horn. And so it's soft and almost hair-like, but in the cow, that hardens. And what he says happens is that with the cow, these activities that we've got in the back of the cow here, which we've just seen as being earthly forces and cosmic substance, which in this discussion he calls etheric and astral, he says the astral and the etheric activities that are taking place in the metabolism of the plant streams forward. And in the deer, those activities are able to extend beyond the head. And in doing so, it makes the deer, sort of sensitive to its environment. And so they're highly nervy and sort of, sensitive to the environment. Whereas with the cow, those activities go to the cow horn and they are reflected back into the digestion. And this is the way that the cow can maintain those full stomachs that it's got. So this tremendous digestive process that it's living in is maintained by the fact that those forces are just being recycled. They're not being let loose like the deer to become sort of intuitive. And that's what the moon is. The moon is the intuitive feminine side, whereas the male, the sun, is the male rational side, you see. And so that's where this intuition of the stag, of the deer, is coming from. This ability for these metabolic processes, the sensitivity, feeling it in your gut, being able to sort of step out into the front to feel what's going on. Whereas for the cow, it's actually recycled. And he keeps talking the whole time about this sort of process of the etheric and the astral forces. Now, earlier on, he sort of puts this into the context of making compost. And he makes this comment about making compost with a lot of green matter, so fresh grass and that sort of stuff. And he says if we've got too much of this volatile, fresh organic, plant material, the astral cannot actually contact the physical. So it can't contact the nitrogen, is what he says. He says the astral cannot connect with the nitrogen because we've got too much of this etheric vitality. And so he says the thing to do is to get some quicklime and put that into your compost heap. And that lime will grab that etheric activity and drag it back. And that will let the astral body come in more deeply and connect with the nitrogen, and you will have a good fertile compost. That's how he sort of leads into this conversation. We also know that calcium, of course, does tend to anchor and trap nitrogen, just chemically. And so he sort of tells that story about the compost, and then he goes on to this story here. And so what we're doing is we're getting these two activities of the metabolic system, and we're first of all collecting it, and then he's saying we can use that receptacle capacity of the cow horn. You know, the ability for the cow horn to send stuff back and contain stuff, we can use that, and by filling up the horn with that cow manure, we can then put it into the ground in the winter time. Now this is a really interesting thing when we think about that, because why would we put a metabolic thing, you know, which is above the surface of the soil up here, why would we get something that relates to that above the earth and actually put it into the earth? Why would we do that? Why wouldn't we keep that line of thought and do something, you know, to stimulate the metabolic process of the plant? But it's not. We're actually bringing it into the earth through the winter time. So we're really binding this thing that is normally above the surface, we're binding it into the soil, so that what comes out is a product that stimulates the metabolism of the soil. That's what it does. It activates and stimulates the biological activity of the soil. And we're doing something very specific. We're getting a metabolic process and we're bringing it into the earth.
Yeah, because the earth is more alive in the wintertime.
It is. But that's when all those silica processes are going on, isn't it? Mm-hmm. This is when he's talking about the whole contractive silica nerve sense processes are reaching their peak.
Right.
So we're getting a metabolic process and putting it into this nerve sense process. Mm-hmm. You know, we're...
Yeah.
You see? We're
which
bringing
is most alive in the wintertime.
Yeah. So we're changing it. We're changing its natural state. We're putting it into a different environment. Yeah. And so we're bringing that influence to bear.
Right.
And so we're connecting that metabolic process to the earth.
Mm.
Can you use a bull horn? What does it have to be a female?
Ideally it's a female horn. Again, people use what they can use. It comes down to practicality. Especially now when all the horns are being cut off as young cows and stuff, big problem. Which is why I've gone to potentising these things and not a problem anymore. This was that picture that I showed there, that we can see in the head that we have these activities, the physical and spirit. And in the back we have these astral and etheric. And this is sort of an interesting picture because these metabolic processes are being turned back upon themselves, and that by doing this we're able to maintain this highly digestive substance. Now we can see animals such as horses and other ruminants that don't have a similar nutritious manure. You know, the horses for a start, you know, it's through really quickly, it's very hot, very fibrous, it doesn't hold its fertility for very long, it causes acidity, you know, a horse paddock becomes incredibly acidic after a short period of time. We've got the sheep again and goats, you know, it's so hard and dry and it's almost like there's not a lot of fertility there, you know, in that sense. Whereas cow manure It's actually quite a stable substance, you know, pH and so on, fertility, it hangs around for a long time. It's usually really worked. And one of the things I sort of noticed about my place when we haven't used a lot of compost on the orchard, and then last year we used this 50-50 chicken manure, you know, put out by one of these places. And there was a very, very different quality that came into the orchard. And what I got was that it was the biology of the animal is what we were getting. Was that in this manure you're getting the remnants of all this biological activity out of the cow's gut, and you're bringing that to the soil and you're inoculating the soil with all of this biology. And that in itself is a very, very good thing. You know, we're getting this whole other strands of living activity sort of going there. And the quality of the nitrogen in animals, you know, the way that the animal manure actually concentrates and stabilises nitrogen, I think is also, you know, part of what we're getting out of animal manure. Okay, so this is the process that we've got going on here. Now, this picture is really deer. This is what I want to indicate with deer, that it's this metabolic process that's being able to extend out into past the head region that gives this sensitivity. Now, we'll come back to this in a minute when we're talking about the compost preparations, where we're making a preparation using the bladder of a stag. And this is why we want to use the stag's bladder, because it's this animal that's got all of this extra sensitivity to the environment, and it's that sensitivity that we're wanting to use. So as I say, quite an important thing to consider with the making of the 500 is that we are actually putting it in the ground through the winter time. And, you know, and why would we do that actually if we follow the thinking? That it's a metabolic preparation. So why don't we do it in the metabolic time, which is summer, and which is actually above the ground. And there are preparations where he does hang them up. The stag one is hung up through the summer. And he talks about really wanting the cosmic forces to really be sucked up by that preparation. And so he does do this. He does hang things up in the summertime. And you know, logically, you would say, well, why don't we do that? But in fact, he's doing the opposite. He's actually bringing it and binding it into the earth at the time when the earth is most alive, because we want to stimulate the digestive processes of the earth. So this is what this preparation does. Now, when you use it, what you'll find is, the last comment in this lecture is he says that when you use this product, you will see that this pushes from the bottom strongly. And that's what you see, that there is this very active, lush growth that occurs. And yeah, and that's where we're seeing these earthly forces active. That we do see this sort of big mass formation. One of the other things that you'll see is if you use too much of this, it will actually inhibit plants going off to seed. It'll cause big, lush, watery growth that just keeps on going. So that's an interesting thing to observe, which is essentially the same picture that we saw before. Okay, so now the 501, he doesn't really say much about that, other than once you've done this 500, you can also make another preparation made out of quartz crystals, and you grind those quartz crystals up into white sand, and then you can put that into a cow horn, put it into the ground through the summertime, and then you can spray that over your plants, and what you will see is that the 500 will push strongly from below, and the 501 will pull from above, which is quite a statement. You know, how do you rationalise that? that this thing is pulling from above.
Yeah.
And one time I threw this up onto the BD Now email list, and Hugh Lovell answered it quite well, I thought, because what he talks about is in all these preparations, they are organising things, and that's their primary role, that they will organise something. And so when you're spraying the silica into the atmosphere, you're actually organising the atmosphere and bringing it into a greater sort of organisation, and that in itself has a sucking potential. You know, it's like once you get the spiral rolling, and so you're organising your atmosphere, and that in itself is sort of drawing the plant up. Okay, explanation. What I think is going on myself is that the 501 is, it does a couple of things, and it's just so this is your 501. What's happening here is that the silica is a nerve sense substance. It's totally related to our head region. As I said earlier on, you might remember, if you've got a headache, it's because your metabolic system is coming too strongly, and you can push it back down with silica. And so it stimulates this sort of strengthening of this nerve sense system. And so this is what he's doing here. He's saying we can get a nerve sense preparation, and we can strengthen the activity of that nerve sense. Again, he's linking it into the metabolic system, as I say, by putting it through the summertime. And so he's doing that same thing. He's sort of, you know, getting whatever the substance is and moving it into the opposite domain, so it'll work in that opposite domain. And so what's happening here, if we put this in the context of the plant, so when we're looking at the plant, the way I see the plant working is that we've got these four processes going on. And so with this cosmic substance, the light and the warmth, if we've got a lot of light and warmth, then that comes down, that sort of centre of gravity, let's say, comes closer to the plant. And so we will get things like in this coming spring, they're talking El Nino, and it's going to be so dry, and a drought, and all that sort of stuff. So we know things might go off to seed quicker this year than normal, right? And so we're going to make a bit more of an effort to water our plants, mulch our plants, and keep this whole earthly watering process up a bit to try and balance that off. But we also know that we've got this upward moving silica process that's taking place. And so when we're doing 500, we're getting this metabolic process and we're bringing it into the earth, and we're, in a sense, stimulating the earthly substance. And this earthly substance, when it grows out of the ground, is going to be an upward process. Okay? The other upward process that's taking place is coming out of this cosmic force. So the warmth and the light that's come into the ground and then is going to be working back up with the clay is also an upward process. Now, for my money, 501 affects both this light and warmth by pulling it down, and if you use it in the autumn and in the early spring, like now, it actually stimulates the upward silica process as well. So what he's talking about is that the 500 is going to be pushing this upward process, and the 501 is stimulating the light and the warmth, and so it's actually bringing that seeding process in more strongly. Okay, so it seems to pull the plant off to seed, is what I'm saying. Is when that comes in too strongly, as it will this year, it will tend to suck the plant upwards and send it off to seed. But what he didn't say is it's actually also stimulating this upward force. So he didn't say there's two upward forces and both of them are stimulated. He actually said this one will appear to be the upward force and be strong, which it will, and this one up here will tend to be also showing as being strong, which it does. But don't discount this one. This one is also strong. And what I'd like to, well, I've got to dig it out so I won't show it. But the point is, if you don't have the clay, this isn't going to work. That's what I'm, a big message for us in this area is that this will not work properly. And even using 501 will not solve your problem. You can be pulling this thing in, but you still won't get a solution to your fungal problems.